Tobias, it's wonderful to be here with you today. I've been looking forward to this conversation. And of course, we are going to talk about culture. You Can Culture, which is the title of your book, which we can see on screen. I have it right here with me. Transformative Leadership, Habits for a Thriving Workplace, Positive Impact and Lasting Success. It's a great title of a book. It's a statement. It's an action. It conveys your spirit, your body of work, your movement. And I think it's fantastic. So I want to get right stuck into the topic. But before I do that, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, David. It's really, really an honor to be here, and I'm an admirer of your work, your writing. So thank you for having me.
Pleasure. That's very kind. So, you work with a lot of individuals and most of all companies on helping them build healthy cultures, better cultures, which is good for the organization, great for the human beings, of course. Just let's start at the big picture. When you experience a healthy culture, what do you look out for? What are the signs?
So I think that in my definition of cultural health, I think about it as a culture that enables the organization to deliver on its mission, its objectives and strategy. And of course, that looks different from organization to organization. And that's where, of course, your culture needs to be aligned with what your objectives, your vision, your strategy, your mission are. Then I think the second part of it, I think that it is a culture that enables you to create a thriving workplace, a place where people have the psychological safety they need and the environment they need to do their best work, to develop and really an environment that is free from dysfunction in that sense. And then the third aspect of it really comes down to having a responsible impact, that the impact of our actions, of our decisions, of our operations as an organization, that, and of course this is hard, this is tricky, but that we try to stay aligned with the values that we say are truly important to us, to make sure that the impact that we have on human beings outside of our organization as well is as positive as ever possible.
Well, that's a very substantive answer. That's a very comprehensive view on culture. And that's a very demanding ask if you think about the responsibility on leaders and people involved in shaping and evolving culture. And of course, none of us want to be working in an unhealthy culture, but it sometimes can creep up on you. When it does, how do you, I feel like, anticipate? How do you get a handle on what's going wrong? So actually, you read the books, you read your book, you know what it should be, but actually you just start to sense that something's not quite right. How do you know when something's beginning to become unhealthy?
Yeah, no, of course, that's a great question. And something that I raised in my book is that so many leaders and organizations, that we live with this assumption thinking, oh, but we're a good organization. We have a great culture. We have great values. And I think it's really important to change that assumption, to instead think that we are vulnerable, that our organization, our culture, and of course in large organizations, we have many different cultures, that we are vulnerable to a toxic environment. We're vulnerable to acting out of line with our values. And if we have that kind of sentiment, if we have that perspective, then I think we'll be also much more able to listen to the signals. I think one thing that I think is really clear that I see in unhealthy cultures is that there's a sense of a silence. And that silence doesn't mean that people are not talking, but that there are certain things that are not said and things that are really important for the organization. So I think watching out for those things can be an important thing. I think another thing is, how do we start to rationalize different things within our culture, within the way we operate, that are dysfunctional, that are unhealthy, that are unhelpful to our organization, and what does that rationalization look like? And because I think that's something that really has a sign that shows that something is not right.
That's very insightful. That point on silence and the fear that often is, palpable. I remember one leader had, created the culture playbook, was getting on stage talking about different aspects that you just talked about, very, very eloquent. And then you'd walk into the room with that person, and he would just instill anxiety, and actually talked about the word anxiety. And then he would, I find it's nearly laughable. I wasn't working, it wasn't my previous organization, it was another one. He'd say, "Come on, everyone, let's get really creative." And everyone was just absolutely so fearful. The culture was so toxic that there was silence, and you'd get frustrated. And it's often the dissonance, isn't it, between the two, which is the big statements on values and behaviors and so on, and then it's the lived experience day to day.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about values and right from the beginning, and understandably, if you're an organisation that has lost sight of their values and has come to you and said, "Tobias, look, I need some help. We need some help on, frankly, defining what our values, let alone then our behaviours should be." Where do you start?
I think a great place to start is to really looking at the culture of the organization, not starting with some words, but trying to understand what are the strengths in this culture, what are the behaviors that have been promoted so far, what are the principles that we have adhered to, what is it that have led to our success, but then also looking at are there other aspects that are in that sense unhelpful or unhealthy, and I really believe it's important to kind of get the qualitative data, to get the stories of both success, but also about the behaviors that might not be accepted or the behaviors that might be turned a blind eye to. And when we start there, I think we're starting in a much better place, because we're not just trying to find some nice words somewhere that might be very, very far away from the reality of our culture, but we're looking at the strengths and we're trying to put words on those. And then we're looking at what we need to develop. And then I think the question is, what are the things that we will not be willing to compromise with in our pursuit of success? And what are things that we think are important for our success in the longer term? And of course, we can go back to those three things that I talked about: to deliver on a mission, create a thriving workplace, have responsible impact. What is it? What are kind of those guideposts that will help guide us there? And what are the behaviors that, if we saw these behaviors, multiplied throughout our organization, they would really lead towards that, and then putting words on that. And I think it's so important to think that values that aren't allowed to cost us something aren't worth anything either. So it's so critically important that we decide on things that we truly believe we will not compromise. I think about, for example, the company Volvo Cars, and I've spoken to several executives and leaders there, and people who have left the company, and they all say that in every conversation, safety is like at the top of the list of the things that people discuss. They always start with safety. I think that's a great example of what it looks like when values are real.
And I can think of some other companies that probably need a bit of that in their own, in other aspects of the transport sector, in airlines and so on.
Yep.
I love that phrase, things we're not going to compromise on in our pursuit of success. That feels very tangible, very real. I just want to extend that further. I imagine you, like me, have worked with leaders who get the need to evolve and improve their culture, create a high performance culture. At the same time, they're restless, they're impatient, they want results. How do you do the work you just described in an environment where there is a huge pressure, commercial pressure to deliver? Because some people would think, I know it's important, but actually it's really an HR thing. Actually, we really need to get on with some proper work. How do you deal with individuals like that?
Yeah. So, and I think that, every business is under that pressure in some form. And then, of course, I know from your experience and from mine that it looks different in different organizations and so on. But I think one key can really be to ensure that the things that if you, for example, want to change something, that you put focus on things that you're not gonna stop focusing on when the next budget cycle comes around, or when the next
Yes.
reporting cycle comes around, or when you're squeezed in your sales targets. But these are things that you truly believe are so important. And I think that that's one of those key issues that we don't actually do. So we delegate, as you said, this project to HR, which shouldn't be a project at all and shouldn't be delegated just to HR, because we're not clear on what are we really seeing as so important that we'll stick to it. We'll stick to working towards that change. We'll stick to being consistent and promoting the right things, not accepting the wrong things, because it is truly so important to us. And I think for leaders who are not willing to really answer that question, then I think it's probably mostly a waste of time.
I think the people who are the most commercially focused will love the clarity of what you just said, the decisiveness. What do we really need to focus on, and what don't we need to? And I think they'll find that appealing, because often this work can feel a little bit fluffy, whereas actually it's very tangible, it's very real, and very necessary. And when I talk about tangible, I refer back to your own subtitle on habits. And this is not just woolly stuff or pictures or words on the wall. This is real habits day to day. As easy as it sounds, we all have good and bad habits. How do you go about developing better habits that help the culture improve? Where do you start?
I just want to start by saying that I think it's so important. I mean, we talked about this HR project, and I think it's so important to realize that just like our physical health, that our cultural health is not something that is shaped by this one-time project or that we do an yearly workshop, but it is shaped by the signals that leaders continually send. And of course, that again comes down to, as you said, our habits. And I think when it comes to developing new habits, and in the book, I talk about some habits and practices that I've seen are critical to transforming culture and sustaining a healthy culture over time. But I think in terms of developing them in an organization, I think one thing is to think about that it does take time. And I think we do it best in community. And something that I've seen really powerful in our work, it is to get leaders within an organization together in peer learning groups. And for example, with my book, I actually suggest people to read it over a year, to take these practices and work on it for a month and start doing a change, a concrete change. And then I encourage people to gather, as in peer learning groups within their organization and share their learnings, share their challenges, and share what they're doing, help keep each other accountable. I think that is the best investments really that companies can do in shaping culture, and that will really have a long-term effect.
I love that. And we're going to delve into the 4 habits that you outline in the book in a moment. I guess the one question I have is, the time period. You do take us through a year in the book, and talking to other practitioners, management thinkers, people who've done culture work for real. Some people say, look, this real cultural change takes many, many years, if not decades. Some say, no, actually, you just haven't got the right approach, the right mindset. You can affect culture change within a matter of months. And of course, the context and the organization matters. It's different working with a 50 million euro or whatever currency organization to a multi-billion pound global organization. But if you were to have to generalize, and I know it's a nasty question, but if you had to generalize, do you really think, as a leading question, do you really think you can affect substantial, large-scale culture change within 12 months?
I do think that there are examples, for example, when you get a new CEO in and that's a new CEO puts together a new leadership team and they're ready to do some radical work on changing culture. I do think that things can go faster than sometimes but that really takes a lot of commitment. I do think many times it does take quite a long time if you want to go down to really redefining the underlying beliefs and assumptions that people have. And in one sense, because I think that there's one aspect of driving a specific type of change. And I love something that Edgar Schein told me once. And of course, he was known as a father of modern culture research. And he said that when we tell an organization to radically change its culture, it's like telling a person to radically change their personality. That's a very big ask, but we can develop new behaviors and new habits. And I think that's really a powerful insight, that if we focus smaller, and then I think it's also about not just driving change, driving this specific change, but it's also about learning the behaviors, the habits, the practices that are key for us to continually change our culture, to continually make adjustments, because I think that's a much better approach than coming, after a couple of years into this place where, we have to have this radical change. But if we have leaders across the organization to learn how to affect change in the small things, in the small ways, through the signals they send, I think that is more powerful, and it's also more sustainable.
Absolutely. I also have a slight reaction to the word change, partly because I've gone through change initiatives where it's like, you roll your eyes and you think, oh, not another one. But you keep talking about, the mission, success, the impact. And if people get why it matters and they have a role in shaping it and it feels very practical, you're more likely to do it and, as you say, sustain it. So let's get into those 4 habits then. You talk about getting humble, being clear, getting listening, getting integrity. All very sensible things. And I want to just tease out in your book, you distill what they mean and how you can do it. And I'll leave listeners and viewers to read and at will. But I want to, I guess, call out some questions or challenges to each of them to make sure we understand it. So getting humble, I get it. Vulnerability, being curious, open to new insights and so forth. But how do you get the balance right when you're getting humble without coming across as perhaps underprepared or underconfident to some people? How do you get that balance?
It's a great question, and I think as I talk about it, I don't talk about it necessarily as this just character trait of humility, but I talk about it as an action. I talk about it as something that we continually as leaders need to do, and I don't think at all that it conflicts actually with being confident. I don't think that there's a real conflict there, because I think that, from the beginning when I was writing on this, I actually called it courageous humility, and because I think it has so much to do with having the courage to for example, to admit that we make mistakes, to admit that we don't have all the answers, to admit that we're vulnerable, and I think that when we do that, it just opens up for so much more things to happen from the shared intelligence of our team, of our organization, than when we try to go at it alone. And I've seen so many times leaders that are so I would say that yes, it's conflicting with arrogance, but I do think that you can be confident and yet humble. And some of the most courageous people that I've seen are highly skilled, highly confident leaders who chose to get humble. They were competent, but they chose that, and I think that sent signals to the organization. And then on the other end, I've seen executive teams where you have people who are arrogant, and where you can't move forward, you can't change things until people are ready to change their behavior.
I think sometimes you have to, if you like, call out and describe and distill what you're doing, i.e., by asking questions, revealing mistakes, for people who might think, well, hang on, I expect somebody to come here and just drive the business forward, which may be a bit foolish. But sometimes explaining what you're doing can show people, oh, okay, I get it. Okay, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's do some work then. The second one is about clarity, getting clear. I completely agree. I'm a big fan of clarity, and you've referred to already in this conversation. Again, when you're doing this work and when you're running businesses, there's the expectation I've referred to, there's the pace, there's the politics. How do you, if you like, maintain and get that sense of clarity when the world around you feels busy, turbulent, demanding? What practices can you use to help get that clarity?
I talk in the book about getting really clear on the values and behaviors that are critical, and as we've already talked about, and then about being very intentional in celebrating and recognizing the positive behaviors that we see, and then also dealing with the behaviors that conflict with the values, with the mission that we're wanting to drive towards. And I think it is so incredibly critical for us that we instill that clarity all the time. So that's happening in those small signals that are sent. And again, back to, it's not in the annual CEO presentation, but it is in the weekly conversations. It is in the daily interactions that we create that clarity. And I also think that a key part here, and I'm sure you found that as well, that too many times executive teams, they come together, they make decisions, and so on. For example, they say we should collaborate. They say they give that message out to the organization. But then when each executive member goes out to their different business units, departments, they send very different signals. And of course, that creates a lot of problems. So I think it's about thinking about all those different interactions that we have, and think about what is the message that I'm sending here, and then being really clear on what is it then that is truly important. And I think that's many times, I think an issue is that we haven't taken the time to really define that. We're not really clear on what is so important. And as an executive team, we haven't had the robust conversations where we really brought up our concerns, our differing opinions. So we bring that with us out into our different parts of the organization, and that creates a lot of lack of clarity.
Yes, and when we all know that attention spans are very short, so it makes me wonder why we don't spend more time not only having those conversations, but actually distilling whatever it is, could be the value, the behavior, the change, into a sentence or two. Let's distill it into something really simple, because it's actually hard. Like most things, it's hard to do less and say less and do less. I want to talk about listening as well, because you referred to that. We know that in toxic cultures, there's the silence and the fear. And, it's how do you create the conditions in those environments, and even ones that are not necessarily toxic, but there is just a way of doing business, especially if you feel as though you're on the outside of the business, or you feel marginalized, or maybe down to the color of your skin, your sexuality, the way you speak, lots of different aspects you don't feel in the mainstream. How do you encourage people to speak up, and how do you encourage also people on the other side, in the majority, if you like, to properly listen? What does it take?
So I think it really takes for us, and I mean, if we think specifically about managers, executives, to think about power, and to think about how our power might silence others. And of course, power can be formal power, but it can also be, positional power, but it can, of course, also be things like our seniority, our tenure, our education level, our gender, our ethnicity, and so on. And I think if we understand a bit more that our power can silence others, then we also realize that if we want to get things up on the table, if we want to get the diverse ideas, if we want to get people to actually speak up about their concerns, we can't just say my door is always open. We have to actually invite those concerns. And in the book, I talk about the practice of soliciting feedback. And I think that there's so many simple changes we can make. For example, if I present a strategy, instead of saying, okay, now if you have any questions, please let me know. I can instead say, I know that there are people here who have questions and concerns, and now we're going to take 5 minutes and please reflect, write down your questions and concerns, and then we're going to go through them together. I mean, there are different things that we can do in that way. And I think it's also really helpful to understand that when people think about speaking up, that they go through different rationalizations, like, for example, or objections. For example, this is not going to make a difference. This is beyond my pay grade, and this is going to have negative consequences. And if we understand that as well, then we also need to think really about how can we make sure that we don't send those kind of messages within the organization. For example, when people do speak up about things, that we are very intentional about celebrating that, about recognizing that they did that in front of our organization, even though it was maybe uncomfortable for us, or that we make sure to, even though we decide to do something differently than what a person suggested, we still get back and say, this is what we decided, and this is why your input was important. So I think those are some of the things that we can do to create that better environment. But again, and that's why I also think that humility, as we talked about, is so important, and getting humble, because I think without getting humble, we won't really get listening, because we're not going to realize that we need that. And yes. I remember a conversation I had with Frank Blake, who was the CEO of the Home Depot. And I mean, he spent so much time out in the stores because he realized, I need to understand what matters to the employees that are serving the customers. That's what's most important for me. So he spent the time there, and he was very intentional about asking questions that would get people to give him real answers to what they saw and what was really going on. And I think that's something for all of us to follow.
I particularly admire CEOs and other executives who do that and continue to do it. They often do it at the beginning of their tenure, then retreat back to the corporate HQ, but you've got to stay listening. So we talked about getting humble, getting clear, getting listening, and now we talk about integrity, last but definitely not least. And they're, of course, all mutually reinforcing. I guess we've seen, read about, experienced individuals and executives who've lost integrity, often with very bad headlines. I wonder from a different angle, how do we, if you like, keep integrity with a sense of character? I do worry sometimes that when leaders who are looking to affect transformation of organizations, with culture change being a very important aspect of that, they're so focused or concerned about integrity that actually they lose an element of their own personality. So how do you instill integrity with the best of your own traits without, of course, tipping it over into toxic or bad behaviors?
I haven't so much, I must say, reflected on the conflict between those things, because I think when I think about instilling integrity in a culture, in an organization, I think it has so much to do with, coming with who we are, but I think it's also important to understand that we are not the same in different environments. We're not acting the same in at our workplace and at a sports club or in our home. I mean, we act differently because we're part of different cultures. So and of course, personal integrity is vital, absolutely. But I think we also really need to talk about cultural integrity and think about what is it that, because sometimes, and when I've been reflecting on, for example, I've been working with some organizations that have gone through, these big leadership scandals that have been in the news and so on. And when you look at those, people will talk about, okay, how can we ensure that we have leaders that have integrity? But I think, again, perhaps here is maybe the point where we need to see that we're going to have leaders who fail to have integrity. And how do we ensure then that, as we talked about, the right signals are coming up, that actually, like I've seen with so many organizations, there were red flags and so on, but we didn't want to listen to them, and instead see that people are that we are humans, that we are fallible. And I think when it comes to instilling integrity in the culture of an organization, I think it's so much about what are the stories that we're telling, what are the rituals that we have, and what are the processes and incentives, and are they sending signals that are in line with the values that we say that we should adhere to?
I love that.
So for example, if we say that, let's say we want to have a high ethical standard or whatever, we want to, or take collaboration again, and then we only incentivize individual performance, for example, that really becomes a critical issue. So we need to ensure that the way we actually drive or operate our organization is in line. And then I think rituals are another incredibly important part of that, because they really create connection between people. And I suggest for people, to take the time to reflect as leadership teams, as team and organization, and ask themselves over the last few weeks, where have we acted in line with our values, and where have there been concerns, or where we perhaps gotten off track. And I think those are great things together as a team as well to work on our integrity and to see where are we failing, or where are we perhaps in risk of getting off track, and having
Yes.
those robust conversations about that.
So actually, as you said, that it's really about cultural integrity. It's about the stories, the rituals that we play out. And I guess it's reflecting the fact that they will change and should evolve over time, because rituals taken too far can be quite limiting. But the organizations change with newcomers, changing in markets, different customers they work with. So if I had to distill all this and ask a sort of like a quick quiz question, and you had to think about a single action that a leader could take to make or break an organization, just off the top of your head, what would it be? So what's the, if you like, the one thing, they're only allowed to do one thing that could really make an organization in terms of its culture, what would you single out?
And then this might sound strange, but I would say to create a ritual of reflection, personally,
Yes.
and together, and reflect on the impact of your leadership, reflect on how well you're living out the values that you think are important, individual, organizational, fundamental values, and so on. And then having that ritual of reflection together as a executive team as
I
well.
love that. Many people would talk about it, and then you ask the question, how much do you do of it and how well you do of it? And then people tend to go a little bit quiet. So then the flip side, the single act that can break an organizational culture, what would you call out?
I mean, hypocrisy, saying one thing, but then clearly demonstrating something else. I think that kills any sense of cultural health, and I think that's a starting point for so much that we see today. And I think with employee branding, with so many different things, that we've had this drive towards looking good on the outside, but not spending enough time focusing on the reality on the inside. So I think that hypocrisy, I think, is the worst.
Love that clarity. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. In all these conversations, I like to delve into the individual as well, and also to see how they practice what they preach. So you have your own organization, heart management team, you have associates who work with you, experts. What's been the hardest thing you've had to work on to develop the culture of your own business?
I think there are two things. I mean, one thing I really needed to learn was to get listening, in that sense, that I had to learn that I've actually have a tendency to silence people, that I'm so convicted of what I think is right, and that I didn't listen in a good way. And also coming out of the toxic environment that I came out of, that I had a lot of habits that weren't healthy. So that was one key thing that I needed to really work on. And if I should just say one, that's the one.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. You refer there to coming out of a toxic environment, and you living in a cult as a child is a feature of your book, which I'll allow listeners and viewers to read properly. There's a tease. Encourage them to buy the book. And I can't imagine. I read it. I was very moved, and I've listened to you talk about it elsewhere. I was very moved to tears, actually, in terms of what you must have experienced. I'm going to ask this question, and it's a simple one, but I wonder whether I should ask it. But so I do so with trepidation. How do you recover from that experience as you move into what we might call I guess, the mainstream world? Is that the right term? But how did you recover? What practices did you use? Do you mind me asking?
Not at all. And thank you for the question. And I think that it is a process, and it's a long process, and I think that it still is an ongoing process in that sense. I think having great people around me, my wife is one of those people who have been willing to ask the hard questions, to help me deal with things, who also help give me time. I think also, engaging with the topics really in the book. And I write in the book, and I say that one of the reasons for doing all the research that I've done, and talking to a lot of researchers and so on, how we end up in ethical blindness and all those things, because a part of my story is that I didn't just grow up in that, I became a part of it, I became complicit in it. And
Yes.
so I think that the harder part, I think, is to deal with your own complicity, and realizing what you were a part of, and asking yourself, how in the world did I end up here, and how in the world did I stay here for so long? And so actually having a lot of those conversations, I think, has been really critically important for me, to start learning about myself, and start better understanding what happened with me, what happened with the environment, and how
Mm.
does that happen in other environments as well.
Well, I applaud you for sharing it and sharing it so powerfully and skillfully, and your resilience and everything for working through it. And I recognize it will be an ongoing journey. In all of that experience and all of your work with companies, what would you say is your one superpower?
I mean, I guess I've learned in that sense that my superpower was the thing that I tried to hide, and that is my story, and being vulnerable about my own failure. But what I realized was that I was afraid of how I would be perceived, people knowing that I was a part of a cult. But what I've realized is that as I talk to leaders about, living out our values, building healthy cultures, also work a lot around, responsible leadership and ethics and so on in large organizations, then I realized that my story and showing my example of failing to do all of those things, and how I ended up in ethical tunnel vision, and then showing that this is actually something that, whether of course this was extreme, but that these same things happen in other organizations. I think I've realized that the more personal I am, the more vulnerable I am about myself, the more impact the message actually has on others, and the more
Yes.
they're ready to share and open up and share their stories.
I always ask guests the question of what impact do you want to have on the world around you? You've talked a little bit about that already, but I'd love you to distill that, because it's a philosophical and a very personal question I'm curious to hear the answer to.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, with my work and Heart Management, our company, and with the book, it's like, it's this feeling that it's not that I could just choose to do another job. This is a call in that sense. This is what I feel that I'm supposed to be doing with my professional career. And if we've defined the vision as this, that to see a world free from destructive workplace culture. Understand that's not ever going to happen, but that's really the impact, to see people be in environments where they can thrive, to see the impact of organizations. Because I think another part of it as well is that so many organizations that do have a great and important mission through their products, their services, or let's say it's an NGO or governmental organization, that they fail to deliver on that because of issues within their culture. So to really see a change in that, that's
Yes.
really the mission.
That's very powerful. And then the last question, which is again is more personal. When you're having your absolutely best day, you're smashing it out of the park, you're doing great work, purposeful work, you're having an impact. What personal habits or practices help you the most?
I mean, I think that the habit of reflection is really so key for me personally. So many times, or I would say sometimes, I get too caught up in delivering on work, and I don't prioritize it in the right way. But when I start my mornings, and I go for a long walk, I take the time to read, I take the time to reflect, that really centers me in what is most important. It helps me relieve the stress of wanting to, because I can be very
Yes.
performance driven, and I've seen, and even over this year, I've seen the impact of that, of really being very intentional with that practice, even then when I don't think that I have the time, and how that really changes who I am as a leader, but also as a husband, as a dad, as a friend.
Wow, that is inspirational. You are inspirational. Where can people find out more about your great work online?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that, David. And I mean, you can find out about the book on youcanculture.com, or you can order it wherever you order books online, on Amazon and many other places. And our company is heartmanagement.org, and I'd love to connect with people on LinkedIn, and Tobias Sturesson, you'll see my name there on the podcast. So please just connect. I would love to connect with you there.
Fantastic. Well, I've really appreciated in this conversation not only your candor about your own journey, but also the clarity and the specificity of what people need to do the you can culture. It really is in the granularity of the daily habits that we practice, and how you're very clear about your own focus and purpose and what's acceptable and what's not, and how you actually power your own engine to do that fantastic work. It's been a fantastic and stimulating conversation. I'm very, very grateful to you, Tobias. Thank you.
And David, I just wanted to say a big thank you as well to you, and for the important work that you do on helping leaders lead better, create better, healthier organizations. And I just have loved having this conversation with you. I appreciate your thoughtfulness, your humility, and so thank you for a great conversation.
Likewise. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do check out the other episodes in the series. Sign up to the YouTube channel, to the podcast. Give me a nice rating if you're feeling generous. And Tobias, thank you ever so much again.
Thank you.